Hello, and welcome to Coffee Chat. Once again, we're adding another series to our protection and advocacy and self-advocacy. Today we have with us another individual from P&A. Would you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Bill Dolan, and I'm an attorney. I supervise the adult team at Protection and Advocacy. And we represent individuals from around 18 or so, all the way up to death investigations.
Okay, so we have talked about the situation with children, how P&A provides services to children, and today we're going to talk about the adult population. Fantastic. So I understand you have priorities. Okay, let's talk about the first one that you have, that you all deal with.
The agency we always have as our first priority, whether it's children on the children's team, on the adult team, or even just on intake from information training and outreach, is always to do abuse and neglect, to take those calls, and then when we have the resources, we can go out and do even investigations into those allegations of abuse and neglect, because that's how the P&A system was originally started in the 1970s, was the conditions that people who lived in institutions and that they were being horribly abused and neglected. And so that's always the first priority, I think, of pretty much any P&A throughout the country, would to be do abuse and neglect investigations.
Okay, so that can be anyone from the age of 18, 20 to 79 to grave.
Yeah, and on my team, that would be about 18 or so up to the grave, because we do death investigations, but then within the agency, though, we would certainly take calls too about children as well. So it would be on abuse and neglect from birth to the grave. But P&A, we're not the primary investigator because we are a smaller agency and we're centrally located here in Frankfort, and so it oftentimes will take us a day or so, or even more sometimes, just to travel to get to where maybe the allegations occurred. And so a lot of times what we'll do is to do more of a watchdog agency function to see if the primary investigators are investigating what they need to do, and make sure too that they have an awareness and a sensitivity to people with disabilities, and that really they just don't discount people with disabilities just because they may have a different way of communicating or present a different style of how they interact with the world.
So let me ask you this. If someone were to say that their grandmother was in a nursing home, and there's a lot of sores, bed sores, and they feel like she's been neglected. So they called you. You may not be the primary investigator, but you would refer them to maybe the state ombudsman and work in partnership. Am I correct?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, now what if, and then would you stay involved in the investigation, making sure that an interpreter is available?
That's great questions, because I think it gets at to where you might have issues that are related to people with disabilities, and then also on top of that you may have issues specific to individuals who are the deaf and hard of hearing community. So you could have multiple legal rights that may or may not be violated in that sort of a situation. So it could be that with the grandmother there's an abuse neglect issue with the nursing home itself, but then there might be another rights violation when it comes to when they say someone comes to an interview and they may not have the appropriate interpreter services or the appropriate way of communicating with that person. And so there are multiple layers and multiple rights that are even in that particular situation. But with that individual in the nursing facility, most often if it was a bed sore, that sort of a thing, we would, like I said, have them reach out to the ombudsman's office. And what we try and do at P&A is not necessarily supplant what the private bar would do. So in those particular case where you have a nursing home abuse neglect case, that a lot of times the private bar, individuals, attorneys in private practice would typically want to take a look at that. So we have even a private attorney list, or we can refer people on and say, hey, you might want to even consult a private attorney. So what we try and do is, with the priority process that you mentioned in the beginning, is try and focus on areas where the private bar may not necessarily look at a particular issue, maybe because it's almost too big systemically for them to address, or there's just not enough of a monetary value for private attorneys to take a look at something. And we can get into that with some of the other, like waivers, guardianship, some of those issues are where the private bar a lot of times doesn't have a system set up to represent, where we might be able to provide some additional help.
But you do stay involved,
Oh, yes, yeah.
and that's an important
Yes.
part of this. You
Well,
stay
yeah.
involved.
One of the primary things is we always try and help and try and give people calls back and communicate with people. That we might not be able to provide an attorney to represent them or an advocate to represent them, but we will always call somebody back, try and do it within the 3 business days. But yes, and even if sometimes there's some ethical rules with attorneys, if that person's represented in that situation, we might say, oh, is it okay, why don't you have your attorney call me? Once we've actually made a referral, they have private counsel, and they might call us back and say, my private counsel wants me to do this, and we'll say, ethically, I need to loop your attorney back in. But yes, we will, every call to our office or email or gets a response. So,
abuse and neglect, what are some of the other things that you can talk to us about?
Yeah, abuse and neglect always, like I said, first priority of a P&A system. And then we've spent many years working on what we call Olmstead issues. That's a Supreme Court case that came out in the late 1990s, for folks who are getting older like me, that basically says that individuals have a right to live in the setting of their choosing. And there's some legal words that go along with that, but for the most part, it's don't have the system set up such that individuals have to be isolated to receive services, that because of your disability, we're going to have you be separate from the broader community. And so the idea is to say, let's bring the services and have people live in the settings that they want to live in and have the services come to them. So we do a lot of work with that, especially on the adult side, that we, like I said, my team does to get folks to be able to, based on their client direction, and that's an important point too. We're always client directed at P&A, and sometimes actually on our next topic on guardianship, there's some friction there sometimes because we always do client direction. But if the client says, I'd like to stay here in this particular nursing facility, personal care home, place for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, that's totally fine by us. But if they come to us and say, I'd like to leave, then we try and help that person leave. We might not be able to represent, again, every single person that has an Olmstead violation or wants to live in the most integrated setting, as we'd say, but we can always at least provide information, or we could always, if it meets, like I said, agency priority, and we have the resources, we can have an attorney or advocate represent that person.
If you could imagine, it would also add a little bit of complexity when you have a person who wants to go into a home, and they're deaf, so it would require an interpreter. We've experienced some problems with requests when a person is placed into a home, and that home, they don't receive funds for interpreters. So it becomes a complex situation. They have to provide the interpreter, especially in situations where they have meetings or social time with other individuals. That's complex for us, and that's something you all will advocate for.
Oh, absolutely. Whenever I found when I'm doing my own advocacy or my advocates, the folks I supervise, or anybody in the office, when we start to get a bit lost as to what we should do next, I think you can always go back to what does my client want? What's my case direction from that individual? And they may say, oh, I don't need services or interpreter services 24/7, but in these particular, I'd like to have this, and I'd like to communicate this way the other times. And so always client directed, go back to see what the client wants. But you're right, in waiver programs, I think throughout the country, that's an issue that needs to be addressed, is to how best to not say, okay, we're going to have people live in an institution, not because that's the level of care that they need right then, that they're actually want to live in the community, but because we're not willing to pay for help to have that person live where they want to live, we're going to put everybody together, and then it's less expensive to deliver services to 100 people and all in one place. So that's kind of some of the heart of the Olmstead, the community integration work that we work on. But that particular issue with individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing, we understand that, and as we're going through Kentucky, we're going to Kentucky has a contract to try and revitalize or revamp their waiver services now, their services in the community, and we're involved in that process.
Okay, very good. So so that's the second issue.
Mm-hmm.
What's the third or fourth issue?
One of the other things that we get quite a bit of calls about too is guardianship. Back to where I said that sometimes we do have even more friction on guardianship cases. Sometimes we'll have them on Olmsted as well too, where parents might want an individual to live in an institution, but the client might want to live in the community, so there's some friction there. And then guardianship, where somebody's the decision maker. In Kentucky, what happens is that there's in order to get a guardian, you have to go through, and once you're 18, through the judicial process. Well, 18 to 21, there's a little gray area there. But once you're an adult, you have to go through that process. So sometimes we'll have parents even call who have people with disabilities in their 30-year-old son or daughter, and they think they're automatically the guardian because they're mom and dad, and that's not the case. So but where we might see, again, issues of people with disabilities going through the guardianship process, then on top of that you might have another issue related to somebody who may be deaf or hard of hearing, and then maybe not say the court system isn't providing appropriate accommodations for that person to communicate. So not only is it a very foreign environment for an individual to be in the court system, even as lawyers sometimes you have pause when you're in front of a judge or a jury, but then on top of that you're going to have you might have a communication barrier as well too. So yeah, the guardianship is something that we spend quite a bit of time just really educating consumers and their parents about how that process works.
And if I may say, I think Kentucky is one of the best states out there on guardianship. Other states don't have a lot of process to it, and Kentucky does have more process to protect the individual. And I think that we should appreciate that here in Kentucky.
Agreed.
So the next, you deal with health care issues and Medicaid. Can you explain that a little bit?
Sure. In some of the Olmsted work and really, and even guardianship, some of it is a big puzzle and it fits together a bit. And what the way that a lot of states fund their community-based placements for have folks not live in institutions is to use Medicaid waivers. So we have a lot of time on our team representing individuals who are denied a Medicaid waiver, that they'll say you don't meet the particular level of care for that waiver, or we've seen it too where people have been in the waiver for a number of years. Let's say somebody's in SCL, Supports for Community Living, which provides, again, community-based services and also a residential component too. So if folks need to have a staff residence, you can get that through the Supports for Community Living program. But unfortunately, there's long waiting lists for that program too. So those are, and Michelle P. is another individual program for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and there's now a lengthy waiting list for that particular as well.
If I may, I don't want to interrupt you, but I understand that there is a waiting list. And if there's a waiting list, what do these individuals do in the meantime? Do they just have to wait?
Those are great questions. Yeah, Michelle P. doesn't have what we call an acuity of need to it. It's just chronological date that you've applied, and they go down the list. As an agency, again, get back to being consumer directed, we're always trying to get it so there's additional funding for those programs. With Supports for Community Living, because it does offer residential services, and let's say that mom, dad, or whoever might be providing services to somebody can no longer do that, there's an emergency in the family, or they have their own health emergency, primary caregivers sometimes is just as, can be such a demanding job just to do that. And if they have their own health issue or health crisis, then the person with the disability can actually jump to the head of the line on SCL and get an emergency slot or emergency position within that. So they do have some flexibility, but I think overall, though, we would do much better off if we could have more community-based services and use the fundings to do that. But yeah, there are other waivers that actually don't have waiting lists. The biggest one is, unfortunately, it's called the Home and Community-Based Waiver, which is a Home and Community-Based Waiver. They called it the same thing as what they're called collectively. So there's a Home and Community-Based Waiver for people who meet nursing facility level of care, and that particular waiver has places available.
Okay.
So if people might want to explore that, there might be people who have intellectual developmental disability or meet other waiver criteria who might meet the level of care to get into a nursing facility. And that doesn't mean you'd go to a nursing facility, that just means that you'd be able to access that, and then you could get services in your home.
Well, let me say this. You're giving a lot of information.
Yes.
And talking about a lot of different waivers. If I was an individual calling, I would not understand all those waivers. But you would guide me through those waivers and say to me, you know what? This one does have a waiting list. It's date related, so you're gonna be at the bottom of the list no matter what. This one does not. If it's an emergency, we can move you up because it meets your needs. This one, that's open. We can maybe use this one or this one, but you guide them.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great question. Because what we try and do is, because back to always being client directed. What does the client want, and then can we then maneuver them through the legal system and figure out what legal rights they have, and find out, because we are in Frankfurt and then we get so many people calling us, we get a pretty good perspective and idea as a P&A agency as to what those issues are. And then because our agency, we don't have a lot of turnover, we have folks who've been there for a while, we usually know how to maneuver that person through the system. We might not be successful at it. It is, at the end of the day, legal representation, so we can't necessarily guarantee, or we couldn't, the result, but the effort would be there as best as we could with the 19 people that we have. That's another part of the difficulty of the job at P&A, is that there's an overwhelming need for the services, and you'd like to be able to provide assistance to every single person who calls. So, but we can't. Everyone gets assistance in that we tell them what their rights are and what to do next. But unfortunately, not everybody can get an attorney or an advocate assigned to them. And that's where we go back to the priorities.
Right. So then we're talking about the other priority, and that is the ADA and accommodation.
Absolutely, yes. We do another priority, protection advocacy for individual rights, and that particular federal grant has us look at accessibility issues, accommodation issues for the deaf and hard of hearing community. It might be that somebody is interacting with a medical professional or an office, a dentist, or something like that, and there's an issue with communication, and then that particular provider not wanting to provide a service to that person, or they might just, there's ways to discriminate overtly, and there's other ways to discriminate through just not choosing someone, but there's just discriminatory intent behind it. So yeah, we do ADA work, Section 504 of the Rehab Act work, Kentucky Civil Rights Act. There's kind of back to where I said earlier too about the private bar. A lot of times on those particular issues, the private bar attorneys in private practice are interested in those issues, employment cases. A lot of those things, because there's a way to have a monetary compensation at the end, that the private bar can help with that. But what we do there at P&A is try and fill in those gap areas where we try and help people with disabilities, and then work on a systemic level to try and help as many people as possible, where the private bar might not be able to do. They might take one individual case, but we might be able to do a class action or even threaten a class action and then reach a settlement agreement without even having to litigate.
Well, that's a lot of information.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. I think what we've proven today in this session is you just need to call, because there's a lot of things, and you need to be directed to the right person. You need to make sure your information is accurate when you call, because P&A can do a lot, but they have limits. 19 people for the whole state of Kentucky. But they will continue to direct you to the right person. They will make sure that you get the right information. They can talk to you about the different waivers. They can talk to you about abuse and neglect and what your next steps can be. They can provide a lot of information, and that's important, because information is power. That's why we're doing these series. Would you like to share anything else with us?
I think that would just be about it. Like I said, I think probably from this you can tell that I talk a lot, but we do try and provide as much assistance as we can. I think that's probably one of the more frustrating parts about doing P&A work, is that you want to try and help as many people as possible, but we just don't have the amount of resources to help everybody who calls to get them an attorney or an advocate. But again, based on the client direction, we'll at least provide you information on what to do next or the next steps to take.
I think the important thing is also is that they will try to help. No matter what, they will try to help. Because we need that person on the other end of the phone call or the email to answer us, to say, what do we do now? So I thank you for being here. I appreciate it, and that's Coffee Chat.